Welcome back. Well, the issue of political party funding and the legality thereof have come under the spotlight, with the CR17 and the NDZ campaigns being thrown into the mix. Earlier this year, South Africa witnessed the signing of the Political Party Funding Act into law by President Cyril Ramaphosa. The Independent Electoral Commission recently wrapped up public hearings into the matter of political party funding. But look, some political parties have warned against what they call the over-regulation of party funding. Meanwhile, some analysts hold the view that political parties should have clear internal processes of how to source donor funding. What ethical issues do donated funds pose for political parties? We're joined here in studio by Ibrahim Fakir, the Director of Programs at the Awal Socio-Economic Research Institute, also known as ASRI. Ibrahim, thank you very much indeed for coming through. Look, it's seemingly a common practice, not only here in South Africa, but around the world with regards to funding. But I guess it throws up ethical questions and moral questions as well.
Blaine, it does, but I think we have to be very clear about separating the funding of political parties in the public domain,
right,
as opposed to the latter part of your introduction, which was about funding of candidates in internal political party contests, and they're not the same.
Right.
So different kinds of regulations would have to apply. Now, you're absolutely right that there are ethics which surround the funding of political parties. The most basic and the primary one is that popular adage which says, he who pays the piper calls the tune.
Correct.
So everyone who's funding a political party, and in our system, the elections nationally are contested by a party, not an individual. So here you're interested in who's giving money to which party and for what purpose. Now, you're never going to know the purpose, right? All corporates are going to make pious declarations about, we're supporting democracy and we want to do this because it's in the public good. Well, some of that might be true, but the reality is that people fund political parties because they want to buy influence.
Would it be naive to think that these donors to the political parties can be kept at arm's length, or is there explicit understanding?
The short answer is that it's naive.
It is,
you can't keep them at arm's length. The best you can hope for is with some disclosure that the public would now know who's given what, and then you can track. If there's a subtle political or policy changes which benefit certain types of corporates. So, you relax environmental regulation because a big manufacturer who's actually a big polluter is giving money. So you could track that kind of thing provided there's disclosure. The problem with disclosure is that disclosure has downsides. The downsides of disclosure are that if I were afraid that if Blaine were giving money to a political party and I'm going to be victimized by that party because, they might be unhappy about the fact that I gave money to more than one political party. I might not get preferred government contracts. I may not be involved in public procurement. So it has a downside. The reality is that parties need money.
Yeah.
Quite apart from the fact that parties need money, if you scale that down to inside a political party, it's obvious that candidates who are vying for a position of authority in a party are also going to contest for election, and they want to campaign, they want to develop policy, they need to pay for logistics, they need to pay for venues, they need to pay to travel, to go to different party branches or party structures, to go and campaign, to say, please elect me, this is what I'll do, this is my vision for the party. So all of those things cost money and they all want to be paid. Now somehow they've got to raise that funds inside. So what do you do now? Because remember, in the funding of political parties in terms of the new act, you've got to disclose, right? But it's disclosure to the public. Now, when you're inside the party, who are you going to disclose to?
Right.
Only party members? The entire public? So parties, we believe political parties in our constitutional dispensation are in fact private actors.
Right. Look, it also throws up the question, if you talk about the principal candidate of that party, is that candidate controlled, and by whom, and to the furtherance of what agenda? I think that's what the public is worried about.
Well, you would imagine that the individual candidate who is the premier or the head of a political party is controlled by two different organs. A, the party machinery and the party policy making machine, because they develop either resolutions, policies, whatever the case might be, and that is their constraining factor. So they've got to develop policy on that basis. The second is overall party organs. If you take the majority party in South Africa, it would be the NEC, the National Executive or the National Working Committee. If you take the DA, or if you take the EFF, it would be their central command team. So that kind of organ is one point of control over the leadership, right? And some degree of accountability and oversight is exercised over them through party organs and party members through the party organs. The second is those silent people who we didn't know about but might start to know about because of the new act, those who donate to the party. So you asked earlier, is there a relationship in which you can structure it in a way in which they are at arm's length and you can't see that they exercise undue influence over them? You're never going to know. It is impossible to know. You could track it now that we have disclosure, but like I say, the disclosure is going to have downsides. If you scale that down again into the political party as an internal organization, you would assume that its membership would have control. But the membership cedes control to the parliamentary party, because then the parliamentary caucus is going to be the one who has control over that individual, right? But the caucus will itself be controlled by who was given what position, who was promised what position in the internal contest, who brought me which money, who campaigned hard for me, which factions do I have to satisfy. So those are the people who then start to control that person.
What about the party as a whole, and dealing with the individual, of course? Does political party funding increase the distance between the political elites and the ordinary citizens?
There are multiple things that cause that social distance, as they call it, between a party elite and its ordinary membership. Partly it's intermediary structures such as NECs, NWCs, working committees, other policy making fora. They can do that because they constrain and hold that leader. They hold that leader's feet to the fire, in some cases on the basis of resolutions, sometimes which are out of kilter with what the broader public wants. But then there's donors who do the same. So you have both party organs who do that, but donors can do precisely the same thing. But, you know, we've got other factors in which the social distance increases. We've got a changing social landscape, we've got upward social mobility, so people are no longer in the communities and constituencies which they used to be. You often hear at local government, when you hear of these big protests, people say, but the local councillor doesn't even live in our area. So you've got those factors which complicate the distance that is created between elected representatives and those people who they purport to represent.
One of the other dangers is dictating policy from a donor. We see it in the United States, where the allegations are that the NRA, the National Rifle Association, huge contributors, and certain politicians will stay away or steer away from talking gun control measures. I guess it talks to the point of conflict.
There are always conflicts of interest, and you can regulate conflicts of interest. So we have got, in terms of our parliament, we've got an Executive Members Ethics Act, but that regulates only certain aspects of political behavior. So remember a few years ago when Musi Maimane had an internal contest in the DA for the leadership of the DA with Wilmot James. He was found not to, and he said he did disclose. He disclosed all the money that the DA received. But the question here wasn't, did you disclose what the DA received? The question here is, did you disclose what you as an individual received? Now, it so happened that instance that he was a public representative, so he is governed by this ethics code, is governed by this ethics act, so he has to disclose. For example, President Ramaphosa, he was deputy president at the time in which this whole brouhaha, so he received this money as an individual, as President Ramaphosa, for a campaign inside a private entity, the ANC. But as a publicly elected representative, he is mandated by the Executive Members Ethics Act or the Parliamentary Code of Ethics to have to disclose because he received it as an individual. But what if you turn around and claim, but I received this in my private capacity for an internal contest in a private party? Complicate it further. What if Blaine Herman, a non-elected person, was vying for a position in the party? So you hold no public office, there's no obligation from you from either of the regulatory frameworks to disclose. You're a private individual who's going for a position in the party. Should you then disclose? Who are you going to disclose to? So the problem with regulation, and this is any kind of regulation is that as you try to close the circle of loops and gaps and holes which are open for abuse, the moment you close one, another one is going to open up. There's a point at which, Blaine, absolutely no regulation can help, and your basic values of trust, of honesty, of transparency, of your personal ethics and individual ethics are going to have to kick in. And we find a decline of that kind of public ethics and morality amongst most of our political actors, whether it's parties as organizations or whether it's individuals going for positions.
Well, let's explore that a bit further and talk about the Political Party Funding Act. Currently, the draft regulations being worked upon. Nothing, as you say, is foolproof. There are shortcomings. On the face of this bill, do you see these shortcomings that might render this act futile?
There are obvious ones, which some of them have already been aired to public hearings. One is that disclosure only needs to happen for donations over 100,000. So what happens
you get those
if smaller amounts are starting to give? Now you're going to have to underwrite regulations which say, can we find some arbitrary total in a year over which you cannot, which you are not allowed to give? So you're going to create a threshold. In the formal language, they call it a cap on donations. But then are you going to police every individual donor and see to which different party they gave and to what extent, and then total it up? That's the one. You can have on the flip side caps on expenditure. You can say to parties, right, you can only spend this amount on election campaigns, on developing policy, or on running congresses. But parties will turn around and tell you, sorry, but who are you, A, to dictate to us how we should spend the resources we have and in which areas? Number one, you are curtailing our freedoms. And number two, more importantly, what happens if you start hiding all of those things under, as we popularly call in South Africa, creative accounting? And the third, more important problem is, what if you hide all those donations in kind? So instead of saying, I'll give you money, or I'll do this, or I'll do that, or I'll pay for this, you will suddenly privately organize the printing of the t-shirts and donate it, or provide food, or do the logistics, or provide a venue. All of those are hidden costs which you are not costed, which are not resource open, but are costed, and they costs that parties carry. So you can hide all of these in all kinds of ways. So I don't think that this new act, as much as it's been welcomed by many people, is going to solve many of the problems. In fact, it might complicate some of them. Some of them might start going to procure funds in ways which we don't know, through criminal networks, through hidden donations, through secret donations, through the hidden expenses that I've outlined. So there are all kinds of ways of circumventing it. The most obvious one, the most obvious gap in terms of the act is the limit of 100,000. What happens if you start donating slightly lower than that?
Look, if we look at it in another way, in terms of opposition party and donations made to opposition parties, if it could be, as I remember Stephen Friedman opined, could be seen as a safety net for those donors who, I guess, want to make public their donations, because if you, as a company, makes a public donation, goes and applies for a tender, government tender, then get rejected, you could claim, it's very obvious, that it was political mistreatment, isn't it?
That is possible. That's one of the downsides, but that's also a disincentive to getting people to donate. People would rather say, listen, we're always getting the blunt end of the stick here. We never had the sharp edge, so why should we contribute at all? And then you start finding that the money drying up in the pot starts to decrease, and then parties claim, but we need monies to be able to function, and then you increase the public funding of political parties, which means that you and I as taxpayers have to start paying more tax, because a greater number of public resources are going to political parties. And in a country and a social context like ours, of very high inequality, high levels of poverty, massive other pressing developmental concerns, would you, as a matter of priority, want to direct public resources to political parties, or do you want to direct them to development initiatives? So that's the one set of debates it's going to open up. Of course, there are some corporates who, even before the act had come in, for example, I could single out, and this is not free advertising, but places like Standard Bank and MTN made public their donations already, about who they were giving to, and what proportion, what amount. That doesn't always serve as a safeguard to believe that I could turn around and say I've been punished because I've given other parties. But the real disincentive for me is that when it is publicly perceptible and you think you're going to be punished, you might end up withholding, donating rather than keeping it.
Yeah.
There is another option. All those who want to make donations donate to a public pot, and that pot is then distributed. The problem with that is that you then have to reconfigure the proportionate formula, because at the moment the proportionate formula of the public funding of represented parties is entirely skewed to those who are already major beneficiaries.
There's always these grey areas and loopholes. Ibrahim, there's developing stories around. I know you came in to talk about donor funding, but there's developments in KwaZulu-Natal as well. The mayor, if reports are correct, maybe on her way out. We'll get some confirmation at 1 o'clock. What do you make of the developments there?
Look, the KwaZulu-Natal and Durban in particular has been seriously problematic, not just because of the broader political dynamics. Here you are talking, again, Blaine, about internal party rules. So here are these candidates who say we are subject to the discipline of our parties. That's what they always say. Well, here's the discipline of your party. Your party organs are telling you that we don't want you in office anymore. Yet there is an individual who insists that they ought to remain in office and will contest any decision made by their party. Now, if you talk about a removal of a mayor from council, there are formal processes which have to be followed. Either a motion of no confidence or a removal of a mayor on the basis of misconduct. But there is a third. In the public sense, it would be an automatic resignation. Now, if you take the public and you reflect it in terms of the private political party says, in terms of our rules and our structures and our constitution, which you signed up to as an ordinary member, you were deployed to this position. This party's organs are now asking you to undeploy yourself. Here you have an individual saying, I'm not prepared to do that. It must tell you that there is something else at stake here. That the person has to remain in that position, and people who support her or that faction have it in their interest to ensure that she's in that position.
I know we're fast running out of time, but I want to talk about the so-called unity project within the ANC. You have this playing out in KwaZulu-Natal, where you have Zandile Gumede's supporters and those that are opposed. You have Jacob Zuma now and Hanekom butting heads legally, we understand. What does that do?
There is no unity project in the ANC. Anyone who wants to now claim that the ANC is united and are working for unity is living in a fool's paradise. There is no such thing. The party is now not only factionalized, the party is fractionalized. And its fractions are making constant everyday realignments on the basis of what they believe are their interests, and their interests are not always political. Sometimes factionalism is good in parties because factionalism allows one faction to hold another to account. It makes for dynamic policy making. It allows for internal democracy. Here you've got factions and fractions which are based on much narrower considerations. They're not about internal oversight. They're not about improved policy making. They are actually about special individual private claims, and they're about immunization from prosecution.
Ibrahim, thank you very much indeed, as always. Always appreciate your perspective. All right, that was Ibrahim Bakir from OWL Socioeconomic Research Institute. And that's how we wrap up the program. Let's bring Desiree Chauke into shot.
Just to say goodbye.
Just to say goodbye. Thank you very much indeed for your time.
How are you doing?
Well, so we'll see them tomorrow.
Absolutely. Ciao,
All right.
ciao.
Take care. Bye-bye.